Good to see all of you this evening. We're going to be in Luke chapter 24 here in just a moment. We have been studying the various challenges and really the dark and sad period that comes at the end of the life of Jesus, and all the mockery and shame and the physical abuse and things that Jesus had to experience even before he is ultimately crucified upon the cross. But when we get into chapter 24, we get to the victory part. And we get to be able to appreciate and learn about that great resurrection message, which is where the power of God is revealed. That even though it seemed like such a dark moment, and almost as if Satan had won this great victory as the Son of the living God is crucified upon a cross, when that empty tomb becomes the reality, it changes that whole dynamic. And so we'll talk about that, Lord willing, this evening out of chapter 24, at least portions of it. But before we do that, let me share with you a little bit tonight in review by looking at the questions that we had for chapter 23. And so if you want to get that out, I'm going to move up to this pulpit area because I just realized that I'm using multiple screens, and this is the one that's got those questions, and I need to be able to, oh, wait a minute, I can do that down here. Never mind. I should remember what I could do to make that happen. But anyway, I'll never be able to read them from down there, though. Can't see that screen back there well enough. Anyway, so at the beginning of the chapter, chapters 1 through 5, and John, this one, I don't think you can show this if you want, but you don't have to do that for the live stream. When members of the Jewish council took Jesus to Pilate, what did they accuse him of, and why did they change their accusation?
Not paying taxes.
Okay, so when they bring him before their council, they charge him with what kinds of things? Things against, well, in their council, they accuse him of things against them. But when they take him to Rome, when they take him to Pilate, they want to accuse him of things against Rome so that Pilate will address it that way and create consequence for him. Why did Pilate send Jesus to Herod? Right, so as soon as he heard he was a Galilean, Herod's in charge of Galilee. I'm going to send him to him and see if he'll address this. But what did Herod do? Yeah, he listened, but he just sends him back. It doesn't really do anything as it relates to it. What were the circumstances that led to the release of Barabbas?
Released one a year, and he gave them a choice, Barabbas or Jesus, and the people chose Barabbas.
Okay, so it was the custom around the Passover to release unto them, and generally that person, historically, if you read some secular history, that person generally would have been somebody that would have been kind of under political arrest. Maybe they were outspoken against Rome, and so Rome didn't really like them, but they really weren't doing any harm to the community. And so those are the kinds of guys that would normally be released at this point in time. And Pilate knows that, and so he brings the worst guy he's got. Right? Somebody that he thought for sure that they would never want Barabbas released back into the community. This guy's a what? He's a murderer, right? Why would they ever choose him between him? But that's exactly what they do. They say, you crucify Jesus and you just let Barabbas go back out into the community. Describe what happened on the way to Calvary. Luke's the only one that records this. Say, okay, so others record the Simon of Cyrene, and then he has a what with, I'm pretty sure Luke records, he has a conversation, right? He has that conversation with the women, and he's the only one, I believe, of those gospel accounts that kind of talk about that situation. Describe the scene around the cross.
John to take care of his mother.
Okay, so yeah, that's I don't think Luke talks about that, but it is part of what happens around the cross. What kinds of things does Luke seem to focus on? In verses 32 through 38. Okay, he talks about those criminals. Okay, talk about the parting of the garments.
Save yourself, bring you down.
And right, so they talk about some of those issues. What statements from the cross, what one thing in particular does he mention that the others don't? Yeah, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That happens in Luke's record and not in anybody else's record as it relates to those 7 statements that were made upon the cross. What caused one of the thieves to defend Jesus?
One thief said Jesus hadn't done anything.
Okay, so why would he come to Jesus' defense? What was going on that he would come to Jesus' defense? All right, and so the people that are there are mocking Jesus. And then one of the malefactors, one of the thieves, joins in with them in mocking Jesus. And then the other says, wait a minute, we're guilty. We deserve, in other words, the punishment we're receiving. This was an innocent man, and that discourse that happens between the two. What happened when Jesus died? Right. So we have that moment where the veil of the temple was torn in two, and that happened throughout that whole process, that darkness that they talked about. What did Joseph of Arimathea request of Pilate? Right, the body of Jesus, right? He goes and he begs the body of Jesus, and we talked about that, actually, some of that last Sunday. And what did the women from Galilee plan to do? Right, so they follow Joseph because he comes and he takes the body. They follow him so they can know where Jesus is going to be buried. Then they leave so they can prepare things and get ready, but they can't do it right away because of the Sabbath day, so they got to wait. And so they make sure they know where Jesus is going to be, where his body is going to be, and then they leave, and then they're waiting for what day, which is what we're going to talk about now. Right, they're waiting for the first day. They're waiting for the Sabbath to get past, and then for daybreak to come on the first day of the week, and then they begin the process of all the scene that we're about to see unfold for us in this study. So, but let me switch, and we'll share some of those charts like we've been doing with you here in just a few moments, as we try to remind ourselves. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. So let's go through Luke's record. This has been our pattern of study. Let's look at Luke's record first, and then we'll come back and we'll add the other narratives to help us get the fuller picture of everything that's going on as it relates to him. So upon the first day of the week, the text says, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. Now, I'm going to bring something up, and I'll see how you react. And if you react with silence, then I'll just move on. If you react with questions or comments, then I'll allow you to talk about it. But so if you read like Matthew 12's account, and in Matthew chapter 12, if you recall, they were wanting more and more signs, right? Show us another sign. Give us another miracle. Oh, we'd be believers if we just see a couple more. And Jesus gets frustrated with those rulers among the Jews that were doing that, and he says, I'm only going to give you one sign. And what was it? Jonah. Sign of Jonah. And he reminds them that the sign of Jonah was that he was in the belly of the great fish 3 days and 3 nights. But Jesus dies, though, the day before the Sabbath, which computes to our Friday, and he's raised on the first day of the week, which is the day after the Sabbath. So how does that work?
Parts of 3 days.
What's that?
Parts of 3 days.
Okay. So, and I just offer this because it's one of the things that some people argue about the lack of validity in Scripture. Because Jesus makes the statement 3 days and 3 nights, but if we understand the time frame that we just studied in the previous chapter, you don't have literal 3 days and 3 nights. What you have is a couple hours of the day left of the day before the Sabbath, which computes to our Friday. Then you go from And their Jewish calendar or Jewish day generally ran from 6 morning till 6 at night, right? So that would be and once sundown was over, you're kind of into the next day, the way they generally work things. But so you've got a few hours of that day, then you've got the night leading into the Sabbath, and you have the daytime of the Sabbath, and then you've got the night of the Sabbath leading into the first day of the week, and then daybreak. So I can get 3 days, right? I can see that. I can see the part of the day on Friday. I can see all of the daytime on Saturday, and I can see the dawn of the day on Sunday. Where do I get the third night from?
What do you consider night?
Well, I'm asking. And some might argue that because it turned dark, although their schedule wouldn't look that. I don't know that they would view that as night just because it went dark. I think that was more of a sign, and he's not dead yet. Yeah. So, but he's right. But he's not buried in a tomb in that darkness period. So we can't use that. Again, I'm not trying to. I'm just, I think in some ways we kind of got to educate ourselves a little bit about this, because you're going to run into somebody someday that maybe challenges Scripture on the fact that Jesus says 3 days and 3 nights, and then you turn around and say, well, he was crucified on Friday. How's that work? And so I'm just, okay, show of hands. I never asked for hands. Let's show of hands. Who's ever even thought about this before? Have you thought about it before? Okay, right? Okay, so here's the interesting part. Let me ask you this question and jog your memory about Scripture. When the Bible speaks about how long Jesus will be in the tomb, what's the most common phrase that you hear? 3 days. The most common phrase you hear in reference to how long Jesus will be in the tomb is 3 days. In fact, there are more passages of Scripture that use the phrase 3 days, and I will come forth, than 3 days and 3 nights. What's the context of Matthew 12? And I already gave it to you, by the way. What's the context of Matthew 12 when he uses the phrase 3 days and 3 nights? Right. The example of Jonah is the under discussion. You all want another sign? I'm not giving you any more miracles. You want a sign? You pay attention to the sign of Jonah, where he was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of that fish, and he came forth, and so will the Son of Man come forth. Jonah is an illustration of what Jesus will do, not necessarily the exact replica of what Jesus will do. When you're looking at the various narratives that talk about what Jesus plans to do, he says 3 days. Let me illustrate it one other way for you. And I should have pulled this scripture up on the screen first. And just to illustrate that what I'm saying isn't uncommon for somebody to use the phrase 3 days and 3 nights, but not necessarily literally mean we're going to get 3 sunlights and 3 darknesses in a row before this happens. Go back into Esther chapter 4. And I want you to notice, and I'm just trying to give you a biblical example of how this has worked. Esther chapter 4 and verse 16. And I'll show it to you on the screen behind me as well. She says to them, "Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days," what? Night or day. 3 days and 3 nights. "I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." Now, Jump to chapter 5, the very first verse. Now it came to pass on the what? On the third day. She told them, I want 3 days and 3 nights of fasting. But by the third day, she does what? She goes in. On the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw her standing in the court that she obtained favor in his sight. He offers the golden scepter and she goes in. What's my point? My point is she said 3 days and 3 nights, but they didn't do 3 days and 3 nights. On the third day, they didn't wait another day. On the third day, she goes into the courtroom of the king. It's the same kind of language you see with Jesus. 3 days and 3 nights, but literally though on the what? The third day of this process, he came forth from the tomb. 3 days and 3 nights with Esther, but by the third day, she's entering the court of the king. Same language and the same result in terms of timing. Even though she said 3 days and 3 nights, by the third day, under our general understanding of days and nights, we'd say she'd have to wait what? One more, right? She'd have to wait till day 4. If she said 3 days and 3 nights, then that's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You got to get all 6 of those quantities in, and then it'd be the 4th day when that would end. But that's not the case. If you look at the rule of the kings, you might have a guy that ruled for 1 month, and he's considered to have reigned what? The entire year. He gets credit for a year's worth of reign, even though it might have only been for 1 month. That's how sometimes when you go back and you begin to do the chronology of those kings, you go, wait a minute. This guy said to have reigned for 6 years, and this guy said he reigned for 7, but they overlap if that works. And how can that be? Well, one may have been 2 or 3 months of that year, and the other guy was all the rest of it, and vice versa. My point is that generally within Scripture, any portion of anything that occurs is considered the whole when it comes to time and events. So my argument would simply be that when you're talking about when Jesus was talking about when he would be raised from the dead, repeatedly you see on the third day, on the third day, on the third day, in multiple texts. When he was trying to convince that group of individuals in front of him who were saying, give us another sign, give us another sign, give us another sign, his frustration says, I'm not giving you any more sign except for the sign of Jonah by illustration of 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so will the Son of Man come forth out of the tomb. So I have no issue with the fact that Jesus did exactly what he said he was going to do. On the third day, he came forth from the tomb. And that's what he repeatedly said he was going to accomplish. And though there might be one example, one illustration that Jesus was using that uses the phrase just like Esther did, 3 days and 3 nights, it doesn't change the literalness of what he had been saying all along on that third day. And so you've got part of Friday, part of Saturday, and then the dawn of that first day of the week. And it can be really challenging, right? Because you've got a Jewish calendar and day system, timing system, but the Romans are in charge, so you've got, and even within Scripture, you'll hear phrases like midnight, which was a Roman concept. That's a Roman concept. When Paul was in Troas, the text says that Paul preached unto midnight. That's a Roman concept. That's not a Jewish concept. That was a Roman concept. The Jews didn't have a midnight in that sense of timing. They had from first hour of the day to the 12th hour of the day, and then you'd start it all over again 12 hours later than that. And so it can be troublesome, challenging at times to try to sort through some of those things. Go ahead, Gene. Times where Jesus is on the vessels, and they would talk about from as fortified areas would have watchmen, and yes, they would reference sometimes throughout the night when those watchmen were paying attention to try to give somebody an idea of how late in the evening Jesus was out, and that is true. Any other questions or comments? I'm just trying to pull my screen back up. Clear as mud. All right. Yeah, now that we've resolved that. But and again, I want to make sure, because we could just skip it, right? We just act as if it's not real, and then you'll bump into somebody sometime that maybe will ask you, and you'll say, "Well, I've never even heard of it. I've never even given it a thought." Well, I wanted to make sure you at least gave it a thought, and have at least a general understanding of how it's possible that Jesus came forth on the first day of the week, which follows the Sabbath day. And the text, all of the texts that reference it seem to be pretty clear that he dies on the preparation day. Otherwise, none of that makes sense, right? If he died, because you can read, you pick up books and read. I've heard people argue for Thursday, because they see that reference in Matthew chapter 12, and they get in their minds, I've got to make that fit. I've got to use an example. I've got to think about that. I've got to take an illustration and make the illustration fit, when there are tons of other texts that tell us very, very specifically what Jesus meant by that, when he repeatedly says on the third day, on the third day, on the third day. So they're trying to take an illustration and make it the primary, rather than the repeated statements that Jesus made to explain what he meant with that illustration. Secondly, we need to appreciate the fact that if it's Thursday, I've heard some people say Wednesday, then there's no hurry. They can just take care of his body in the moment. There's no preparation for them to take care of. There's no fear that we're going to bleed into the Sabbath day, and we can just take care of Jesus' body right away if it happened on a Wednesday or a Thursday. The only way that all of those narratives make sense is if we're talking about the day before the Sabbath and the hour is about to hit when technically the Sabbath in their minds begins, sundown, right? And they've got to make sure all of that is taken care of in that 24-hour span from sundown, what we would call Friday, to sundown the next would be what they would have considered the Sabbath. And so they got to get all of that done, what they can, and then wait through the Sabbath, and then wait for daylight to be able to go and do anything about it. Absolutely common to them. Yes, it would generally be done in the moment.
They didn't get to it, who was going to do it on the third day that morning.
That's right. They did not have time to give him what they would have considered a proper burial, with a proper burial linen anointed with the spices and oils and all the things. So all they had time to do was put some things together, wait for the Sabbath to clear, and then go and take care of him. If that happens on any other day, they just take care of it in the moment. So now upon the first day of the week, verse 1, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulcher. Now I know, be patient with me. I know other accounts tell us more details about how that happens. I'll get to those. I've got charts on that before we're done. But let's just look at what Luke's saying for now. So they found the stone rolled away from the sepulcher. And so what do? They go in, right? Something's not right here. And so the stone's rolled away, and they enter in, and what do they discover or not discover? Yeah, he's not there. He's not there. They find an empty tomb when they enter in. And it came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, two men stood by them in shining garments. So they go with the intent, they watch Joseph of Arimathea where he took him. They know that a stone had been rolled over the opening of the tomb. We'll learn a little bit more about that when we see these charts here in a minute. The tomb's open when they get there. I would presume their first instinct is, well, I wonder, and we'll learn that again elsewhere, but so they go in, and maybe potentially just assuming we're going to find him and they'll take care of what they intended to do, but the tomb is empty. And then they see what in Luke's record? Two men is how Luke describes what happens in relationship to who they find there. So two men stood by them in shining garments. And as they were afraid and bowed down their faces to the earth, they said unto them, Why seek ye the living among the dead? He's not here. That's what other accounts say. But this is a place where you expect to find the dead. He's not dead anymore. Why are you seeking one who's alive here in the tombs? He's not here. Verse 6, He is risen. Remember how He spake unto you when He was yet in Galilee. He's already told you about this. On the third day, on the third day, on the third day. He repeatedly said it in various scenes, saying, The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified. He told them about all of these things that were going to unfold. They've witnessed it, right? He said it was going to happen, and it did. He said He was going to, and it did. But they're struggling, believing in what? The last piece of the description. Even though they've witnessed the things that Jesus told them was going to happen. They saw Him fall into the hands of sinful men. They witnessed Him crucified. And yet they're still not so sure that this resurrection, even though every other piece of the puzzle has fallen exactly as Jesus had said, they're still not so sure. And then they remember the words. And verse 9 says, They returned from the sepulchre and told all these things unto the 11, and all the rest. And it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. So they go back to those immediate disciples, to the 11 apostles that had gathered together, and there were others present there, and they tell them what they'd experienced, but they're not believed. Peter rises up, and he runs up upon the sepulchre, and stooping down, he beheld the linen cloths laid by themselves, and departed, wondering in himself at that which was come to pass. So Peter gets there, and he looks in, and he sees something interesting. What does he see? Okay, so he sees the linen cloths laid by themselves, orderly, in other words, right? Not something that would have happened if this happened in haste. If somebody had come in there to try to steal a body away or create some sort of problem, the last thing they're going to think about is to be neat and tidy with the linen cloth that had been used in the initial burial of Jesus. That's the depiction here that he witnesses. So this shouldn't have been thought of on his part as something that happened contrary or against the will of Jesus. There are all the clues and evidences are there. Now, let me add the other narratives. If you go to Matthew chapter 27, he's the only one that records a significant and important element to this conversation. He records for us in verses 62 through 66 of Matthew 27 that the chief priests had gone to Pilate and planted the seed of the lie they're eventually going to tell concerning what happens to Jesus. That's that moment where they go and say, that deceiver said that after 3 days. I paused for a minute after all of our conversation at the beginning of our study tonight to remind you, isn't it interesting that when they went and talked to Pilate about what Jesus had said, what'd they say? 3 days. Even their conclusion about what Jesus had taught concerning his resurrection was 3 days. Just put that in your mind when you're thinking about that. It was the conclusion they had drawn based on what Jesus had taught. That he claimed in 3 days he's going to rise again. And they tell Pilate, we think his disciples will plan to steal his body away so it will look like that happened. And that's when Pilate says, you go make it as secure as you can. That's how those soldiers end up there present at the resurrection. That's how you've kind of got this stone that's been helped to be secured and sealed over that tomb. All of that happens. Luke doesn't record it. Mark doesn't record it. John doesn't record it. Matthew records it. That the chief priests had gone to Pilate and told him, this is what we think is going to occur. You may want to make sure that it doesn't. Then you can add what Matthew says about the resurrection itself. Matthew in Matthew chapter 28 then, if you skip ahead, he's the one that tells us that there was an earthquake involved in this. Luke doesn't record that aspect. As with all the other things, I don't know why. He just doesn't. He doesn't record that. He doesn't record the fact that, as Matthew says, there was an angel that descended and rolled away the stone. Luke just says when the ladies get there, what? Stone's gone. Matthew kind of gives us a better understanding of that. That an earthquake had occurred, plus that earthquake is in connection with this descending of this angel. And the stone rolled away. And Matthew's record tells us about those guards that Pilate had told them they could have to make the tomb secure, that they're scared when all of these things are happening in that scene. It's also interesting to note, Matthew speaks of the angel in singular form. Luke says they saw two men. Matthew speaks of it as a single angel. And I'll come back to this slide in a second, but let me skip you to Mark's record. Mark tells us on their way to the tomb, they asked, who's going to what? Yeah, how are we going to get that rock out of the way? We've got all these spices and things. We've got all the things necessary for the burial, but we've got a major obstacle when we get there. How's that stone going to get rolled away? And he says that when they got there, that they encountered a young man. That's how he describes it. So Luke says two men. Matthew says an angel. And Mark records it as a young man. Which one of them was right? All of them were right. How could all of them be right if one says two men, the other says an angel, and the other says a young man?
Different times. They weren't there.
I hear what you're saying, I'm not so sure that can be. I don't know that you've got an angel that comes, then two guys come, then another guy comes. That right? We'd have to have all three of them for that to work. Kim, I think you're on to it. It's perspective. They don't really know what they were seeing, right? There's this bright light, Luke's record, this bright light shining around them. They have this conversation about how he's not here, he's gone. And so as that would get told by those who were witnesses, it would get described in various ways. And I think that's what you have. You have all three of these men. I don't think John, let me make sure I check my charts, but John doesn't even note it in any fashion. So again, it may sound like, well, we've got contradiction again. We don't know. We've got the wrong days and nights. We've got one description of two men, then an angel, then it's a young man. But again, I don't see that as a challenge because they were uncertain as to what they were seeing and confused by the whole interaction to begin with. And so as they would go about and describing this, and keep in mind, they go back and tell whom? The other 11 and everybody that was with them. Then they go and tell, and men like Luke come and hear the accounts of others that try to describe as best they can what they all witnessed. And you're going to get variations. They're trying to describe the unexplainable. If you saw an angel, you might have a trouble trying to figure out how to describe that as best as well.
3 or 4 of us could witness.
That's all that you really have here, is just perspective of the witnesses. And then as that account gets told, then you see that. And by the way, as some might argue that's a challenge to Scripture, I've always looked at texts like that as an actual evidence of the validity of Scripture. And the reason I say that is, if you were trying to write a book that was perfect, don't you think you would have cleaned that up? I think I would have cleaned that up. If I was trying to fool people with something that wasn't true and a lie, I would have done everything that I could to make everything look as pristine as possible. The Bible doesn't do that. The Bible just lays it out there and just tells it as by the record of these men, makes no attempt to try to fabricate something just so that human minds will feel better about it. It's interesting. Go ahead, Bob.
They left filled with joy.
Yeah.
Mark says they left filled with bewilderment.
Yeah. And so, again, based on perspectives, and I don't have time tonight, obviously, the bell's already rung. Lord willing, I'll come back Sunday. I'll show you some more of these charts because there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in this scene as to who gets there first, who tells who what. You got to see all the accounts of the gospel to kind of get a timeline, if you will, of everything that's happening. And would it have been great, I guess, in our human minds to go, wow, could we just have one text that told us, in a nice PowerPoint production of what happened? That's kind of what we want. We don't get that. We get 4 accounts telling us various aspects of what people saw and encountered as it relates to the resurrection message, because that's exactly what God intended, that through earthen vessels, through human beings, the story would be told. And the witnesses would be used for that purpose. Appreciate all the thoughts and comments tonight. And for those who are still watching at home, my apologies. I just now caught on that I did not turn on the mic that catches the audience comments, and so I apologize for that.